Trends are nothing new when it comes to the world of cinema. One film in a particular genre or style of filmmaking scores it big, and then the mentality, regardless if it's Hollywood or any other film industry, is to say, that film scored big with audiences. Let's make that movie again. And then you get imitators, clones, copycats, rip-offs, whatever you want to call them, that all try to cash in on the same thing, and very few ever stand out from the pack. For a time, courtesy of Harry Potter, family-friendly fantasy was the big thing before Twilight came along and made it more about teenagers. For very regrettable reasons, it has to be said, but that's not the topic here today. Trust me, if I were to try and do a Cinematic Confessions on that, we'd be here probably till the next century. But today's topic is something which I have a very personal history with, and I am not very thrilled about. The film in question is The Golden Compass, obviously made to cash in on the popularity of the likes of the Narnia films, and of course the big one, Harry Potter. It's a big fantasy adventure with polar bears and airships and cowboys and evil scientists and souls that step outside the body. And boy, is it a letdown. Oh, and I'm not just talking about the movie. No, I had to read all 3 books that comprise his Dark Materials series back in school. Wow, just thinking about that brings up so many memories. The books, in case you don't know, are basically an atheist Narnia. Basically, Philip Pullman said multiple times that he was not the biggest fan of C.S. Lewis's original books and wanted to make an alternative version of them. Now, of course, there's nothing wrong with that. It's always fun to see new takes on classic stories, and Pullman is certainly a very experienced author. And Golden Compass, the original book, at first seemed to hold some of that promise. Or as I knew it, it was called Northern Lights. And indeed, there are points where that talent does shine through. Philip Pullman is very good at description and does a good job at world building, giving you a sense of the size and scope of the world. And he also has a pretty good knack with some supporting characters, especially the Texan aeronaut, or in more straightforward terms, the Sky Cowboy, Lee Scoresby, who I'm pretty sure for most fans is one of their favorite characters. He certainly was mine. Or, of course, the famous polar bear, warrior, king, basically all-round awesomeness that was Yorick Bernison, and, well, among a few others, but the crippling problem that has plagued the whole series and only got worse as it went along was how belligerently atheist it was. Well, not atheist, rather anti-Christian. Simply put, the whole Christian faith and everything that is associated with it is the bad guys in these books. It's not just Catholic Church is evil. Oh no. This is every facet of organized religion crammed in here as basically the big bad guys, with God being a total fake, and instead everything being run by a psychopathic archangel. If that didn't already sound incredibly hackneyed to you, then, well, it's even worse when you actually read it. I mean, I have no problem with a book series or any type of media trying to ask questions about the way that we interact with certain aspects of society, and in recent times, and even when the book was being written back in the 90s, it's a very pertinent question about the power of religion and its sometimes darker nature. But good Lord Almighty, pun possibly intended, Pullman is not even remotely subtle. Every single time he brings it up, it feels like I'm listening to a boring college teacher trying to lecture me in the most unengaging and ungraceful of manners. There is no maturity to this subtext in the books. It is so over, and it does not even attempt to let you try and formulate your own questions. It straight up just comes out and says, all organized religion is evil, the church is evil, God is bullshit. It even has a line in the actual writing that says, pretty much Christianity is one big mistake. A series, may I remind you, that was intended for children and young teenagers, has a huge religious discourse, but it's incredibly one-sided. There are no really good Christians in this book. No one of any organized faith is even remotely portrayed in a semi-decent light. If you basically so much as say you believe in something, Pullman just basically colors you black and calls it a day. Instead of, being mature and discussing the aspect from both sides and looking at how faith does have its issues and organized religion has a lot to answer for, there are also good aspects to it, and that doesn't mean that we do not have to not believe in something bigger and better than ourselves, that sometimes it can drive us to do better things. And that's just the basics. I'm sure those of you who are into theology or philosophy could probably take it even further than that. But Pullman is so belligerent in this that it pretty much kills most of the book, and a lot of the fantasy elements are completely drained from their fun factor because, well, there's just no balance. Though Golden Compass is probably the most equally distributed of the three when it comes to its extreme Christian hate. And again, it does have its moments, even if sometimes it feels like Pullman is ripping directly from popular fantasy. Seriously, there is one chapter opening where the big bad of the book, Mrs. Coulter, who's also the mother of the main character, gets off of an airship, and I swear to you, it is pretty much the literary equivalent of a shot-for-shot copy of any scene from the original Star Wars trilogy of Darth Vader getting off one of his ships and standing before the stormtroopers. I do not know how that's possible, but Philip Pullman managed to write the equivalent of the Psycho remake in that regard, where somehow he turned visual shots into prose. Then we get on to the Subtle Knife, which, what an ironic name, because this book is probably the most unapologetically ungraceful, unsubtle, and frankly unreadable books I have ever had the displeasure of being forced to sit through. It says something when the opening of Twilight, with an incredibly smug Bella trying to narrate in the most prosaic fashion, is more entertaining than any section of this book. For those of you who complain that the Hobbit movies are too long and are filled with padding, no, you do not know padding until you've read The Subtle Knife. This literally only exists so that we can have a trilogy. This is nothing but filler and our main character Lyra running around with her new quote-unquote boyfriend Will, just going from building to building, looking around for answers that frankly don't get any resolution anyway in the second book, and just serves to have more of the same anti-Christian dogma in there. Again, this is a book intended for the young, may I remind you. In fact, it actually even gets a little creepy at points, because both of our main characters, Will and Lyra, are about 13, and Pullman seems to have a very strange habit of very elaborately describing how Lyra sweats and how wet her face is. I'm not accusing him of anything, but it's a little suspicious that more often than not, when she's reintroduced into any chapter, she's often described as sweaty. Yeah, I'm not going to dwell on that. And then Amber Spyglass comes along, and to its credit, the final battle in the False Heaven, which is known as the Clouded Mountain, is actually fairly well handled. The problem is, this is a book of two halves. One half is the stuff with all the wrap-up and Lyra and Will finally getting to heaven and exposing the whole shebang. The other half, I kid you not, is about a doctor who observes an entire society of little mammoths who move about using seed pods as wheels. I wish I was making that up. Now, to its credit, it's kind of amusing at first, but wow, it is almost absurd how much of the book is just devoted towards detailing these creatures' biology, social interactions, even their hierarchy and structure. Time that is taken away from the important things in the story, like actually resolving what the whole deal with heaven is and what happens to this world once God basically gets the boot. In fact, you can't help but wonder if Pullman only wanted to write Subtle Knife just so he could introduce the scientist who meets the woolly mammoth driving things in Amber Spyglass. However, we're here for the movie, so I'm not going to ramble much longer. Point is, it's a mediocre trilogy with a decent start, a horrible middle, and an okay ending. So, how does the film version of the first book stack up? Well, reluctant as I am to quote the likes of Browncoat Eric, He pretty much nailed it in his review when he said that somehow by censoring out all the Christian criticism elements here, because of course this is New Line, a big Hollywood studio, and they're not going to let anti-Christian agendas get in the way of selling Happy Meal toys. By removing all of that, they actually made it more offensive than it was in its original incarnation. How do you do that? How do you literally make something worse by taking out what was the offending element? Once again, like the book, it has its moments, mainly in a very strong cast here, especially, of course, Sam Elliott as Lee Scoresby, who perfectly nails the role. And of course it also helps when you have the likes of Ian McKellen and Ian McShane voicing the polar bears, and in fairness, the on-screen fight is actually pretty cool and kind of brutal for a family film. The production values are good, and Alexandre Desplat's score, you probably know him as the guy who did the music for the King's Speech and the new Godzilla, is also fairly strong and does fit the whimsical feel of the world. And to give credit where credit is due also, Dakota Blue Richards is actually a fairly good child actress, and she's a lot more likable than the Lyra of the book. At least here they toned down the lying, bitchy aspects from the book. Seriously, she was a pain every time I had to read about her. She was whiny, she lied, she manipulated people. She was literally one of the most insufferable characters to not be named Bella in the history of literature. She's a petty snot, and I'm glad that Dakota brought a lot more energy and likability to her. And thankfully, White's wisely toned down the goofier aspects of the character, so at least she's much more like a normal girl, and is easier to get behind when she has to deal with all the antagonists of the story. The problem is, much like the book, in the writing. This basically feels, even more than the book, like just a patchwork of every other fantasy story you've ever seen. We have little bits of Harry Potter, little bits of Narnia, little bits of Lord of the Rings, and even little bits of Star Wars and other 80s fantasy films in here. Now, there's nothing wrong with homage, but it just doesn't give the film a tremendous amount of identity of its own. And oftentimes, it just felt like I was pointing out, oh, that scene looks like this scene from that movie, and that little bit of dialogue sounds like this bit of dialogue from that movie, and oh, hey, that actor was in this movie who happens to be in that movie, which is very similar. It kind of takes you out of the experience when you're aware of what director Chris Weitz and ipso ergo what Philip Pullman were kind of nodding to, and here it's not very graceful about it. Although in that regard, it's actually a fairly faithful adaptation then. It just never is as engaging as it should be, and not just because it's a patchwork of other films, but also because it feels like a lot of the time it's just very chopped up from its novel counterpart because of all the stuff that had to be removed so this could even be greenlit as a major motion picture in the first place. By taking out what pretty much made the original books noteworthy, you basically have any number of children's fantasy films right here, and this one doesn't have that much to stand apart from it. That anti-religious element, as ungraceful, unsubtle, and ultimately dumb as it was presented in the original books without any real regard for the reader's intelligence, was at least something to make it stand apart. Once you take away that and Pullman's style of writing and you put that on screen, all you have here is just a film that plays like any interchangeable children's fantasy. And again, I'm trying to not sound excessively hyperbolic here, because again, I don't believe in spreading hatred about any type of filmmaker or general artist out there, and I'm not saying that Philip Pullman or Chris Weitz cannot do anything right. But ultimately, I was just not a fan of the novels, and the film version which I saw years later, this is not colored by any kind of affection to the books, just did nothing for me. And sadly, no amount of Ian McKellen polar bears and Sam Elliott being Sam Elliott is ever going to change that.